Hi, welcome to Project Geospatial. I am Adam Simmons, and our special guest for today is Amy Rose of Overture Maps. And Amy, you have a diverse background. We're going to get really into highlighting your expertise and leadership in driving open source geospatial initiatives around the geospatial community, and focusing hopefully on your vision of how to make data more accessible and collaborative for the geospatial ecosystem as a whole. But first, before we dive into all those awesome deep topics, I want to learn a little bit more about you and how you got started in the industry.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Adam, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So, like you said, I have kind of diverse experience, and I actually stumbled onto geography a little bit accidentally. I'm not embarrassed to admit that I had all sorts of majors early on in my college career, and ended up kind of falling into GIS through an internship pretty early on. And what I really loved about it, even though it was really, really early in kind of the geospatial realm, going back, a few decades now, I really loved the idea of putting together the visual and analytical aspects of how geospatial worked. So kind of gave that extra dimension to problem solving. It was like kind of putting the puzzle pieces together and be able to visually but analytically also tackle different kinds of challenges. And so really got hooked on that. And so I'm a geographer by trade, but I've worked in a variety of different sectors, always around geospatial problems. So I've worked in government, academia, industry, and now in the private sector with Overture. I think all through that time, the constant thread has been dealing with geospatial data and going all the way back to when I started. There wasn't a whole lot that was available, so the problem was really like we need more data, and now the problem is we have all this data. How do we make sense of it? And so I feel like that's been a thread, and I want to at least to some degree be able to help solve that challenge.
No, that's great. And so, what's the hook into Overture? How did you get involved with Overture?
Yeah, yeah. So I prior to Overture, I was at Oak Ridge National Lab, and a lot of the work that we were doing there, because we had access to kind of the high performance compute, they are some of the world's fastest supercomputers have been built and run there. And so we had this compute and we had a lot of data. And so how could we bring those two things together to build global data sets for population and infrastructure? And no matter who you are, if you worked in geospatial and you go down the path of I need to do analysis or modeling or visualization, you always start with the data. And it was a constant challenge of, okay, I want to do project X, but before I can do any of that, I have to spend 90% of my time just getting to the point where I have the data, whether it's finding it, curating it, creating it, post processing it, and now I can do my project. And so when I saw Overture launched, both from the perspective of the collaborative map building, but also the idea of kind of putting a standardized scheme around things, but even more so the interoperability aspect of what they were trying to do, I immediately thought this is it. Somebody's finally trying to solve this grand challenge in geospatial that we're all still wrestling with. And so I kind of followed Overture for, I guess it was the almost the whole first year, and then they posted an announcement for a technical director, and so I applied to it, even though I was you know happy doing what I was doing. But I thought, hey, wouldn't it be great if I could be part of this? And here I am, and it has been probably the most fun I've had. Um, Working with geospatial data and getting to work with all of the members, bringing whether it's tools, data, but mostly their ideas and their expertise.
Okay, well, let's talk about why it's so fun. Maybe learning a little bit about who Overture is and what's the mission of it. Is it a nonprofit? Is it what's it all about?
Yeah, yeah. Overture is a nonprofit. It's actually a what they call a joint development foundation, which is a foundation as part of the Linux Foundation. So a lot of people have heard about the Linux Foundation from the perspective of open source code and open source standards. We're actually, Overture is one of the first open source data projects underneath the Linux Foundation. And it was formed in, well, it wasn't formed, I'll say it was launched publicly in December of 2022. There was a lot of work that went on behind the scenes for years in kind of the whole point of why Overture came about, which is, a lot of organizations that were doing exactly what I just described earlier, having to basically build all the map data. And it was duplicative effort because you might have, multiple organizations doing the exact same thing to just build the basic map, even before they could build their competitive advantage on top of that. And so that goes for whether we're talking about, industry, whether we're talking about, an academic research project, or whether we're talking about government. There's this, core of what you do just to get to the point where you can build on top of that for what your core business really is, your competitive advantage. And so the founding companies, which are AWS, Meta, Microsoft, and TomTom, really started talking to each other about, hey, we're all doing the same thing, just to build the same map so that we can use it for our own specific purpose. And so, what about we get together and do this collaboratively in a way where we're not just sharing, you know, resources, but we're creating efficiencies. We're driving down the cost of doing that because it's really something that you can't expect to be done in a really high quality way long term, maintaining really high quality data globally, especially some of the more dynamic features. And so the idea was, let's get together, let's do this collaboratively, and let's do it in a way where we're not just building a map, but we're really trying to enable others to build their best maps. And that gets into some of the conversations around Overture and what they're doing for interoperability. But so those four companies came together, and Overture was launched in 2022. And Esri joined shortly thereafter, and now I believe we're close to about 40 members at this point. Various commercial organizations, government organizations, nonprofits. So folks coming together to realize the efficiencies and the innovation that you can achieve when you bring a lot of different people together to collaborate on something.
Excellent. Now, the way you talk about these organizations coming together for what they're trying to build, of what you're trying to build to help out a community, what types of resources does that include? I mean, you kind of softly touched on maps. Some of the questions I have around a massive data cache that Overture has been described of having. I mean, how do you? And maybe that's maybe some confusion in the community in terms of how what's your unique differentiator and how do you explain who you are compared to either OpenStreetMaps, Google Maps, or some of the other communities out there, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a good point. In fact, starting with OpenStreetMap, I think that's a great place to start. We consider ourselves downstream from OpenStreetMap. Obviously, people that use Overture releases understand and see that OpenStreetMap is one of the primary sources, certainly in our transportation theme, but other themes as well. And all of these companies that originally founded Overture were and still are big users of OpenStreetMap. The challenge with OpenStreetMap is when you are trying to use it, anybody who's used it before understands that the strength of OpenStreetMap can also be more difficult to use in kind of, let's call it a production environment. So the strength of OpenStreetMap being, hey, as a contributor, it's very easy for me to contribute to OpenStreetMap because the tags are there, but it's not so overly structured that it's difficult to make a contribution. It's very low bar to entry in terms of understanding how it's done. On the other hand, when you try to use that data, the lack of that structure makes it so that there's a lot of post processing that would need to be done to standardize around whether it's combining tags into a certain category or any other way that we would consider, standardizing a schema. And so, when we talk about OpenStreetMap, I think I don't think we necessarily fill a gap in terms of that large scale volunteer geographic information, but I think it's more around standardization. When you talk about something like Google Maps, what we're really talking about is developing something that's open. And we aren't saying at Overture that all data should be open, but there are some foundational data that I think for the most part you could consider commoditized at this point, where you can find it as open or you can create it as open data. And those are the types of things that we're trying to do. And so aside from kind of that space, I think that the other gap that we feel is really trying to tackle the interoperability piece. One of the biggest challenges is, just like I mentioned before, still trying to put a variety of different data together and do it very quickly. We're at a point now where, unlike 30 years ago, there's a lot of data and there's a lot of good insight and support for decision making that you can get if you can quickly and accurately put that data together. And that's really the challenge. And so I think the gap that Overture fills is, first starting from the reference map, which is the data we release every month. We're doing kind of that first pass, instead of somebody else having to go out and say, okay, I want all the OpenStreetMap buildings and the Google buildings and Microsoft and all these other sources, and I'm going to put them together and deduplicate them and make sure that it comes out the other end in decent quality. Overture does that. So instead of starting from zero, Overture gets you a good part of the way along, and will continue to add as many high quality open data sets or create data where needed to make sure that that reference map is as complete and as high quality as possible.
So you take all this data sets and you curate it, condition it, and you have a more you have a data set that you can share out. What types of, we just talking about, you mentioned reference maps. You talking about different types of POI data that people can ping as well, individual building data sets. What does it mean to have the biggest cache of open data in the world?
Yeah, so yeah, so it is quite a bit of data. Right now we have, I believe, about well, we have 6 themes, and so those are broadly addresses, divisions, which can be administrative boundaries or other types of divisions like neighborhoods, transportation, buildings, places, which is what most people think of when they think of POI, and base. And base is kind of like the rest of the map. It's a little bit of a catch-all right now. But within those 6 themes, we'll call them 6 buckets, we have about 15 different feature types. So, for example, in buildings, we have buildings, which is kind of the whole piece, and then we have building parts. Those are 2 different feature types. Um, in addresses, we just have one feature type, which is the address point. In divisions, we have points, lines, and polygons to represent different things. So we have 15 different feature types. And right now, I believe we're at about 500 gigabytes of data total that we put out with this latest release in March. And that covers almost 200 unique sources of open data that we're pulling in to create that release in various themes. So I mentioned that you have a lot of OpenStreetMap data that is a primary contributor to like the transportation theme, but you have other themes like addresses where we are pulling together at this point, dozens and dozens of different source data to compile one consistent address database.
And just to confirm, this is a global database that you have, right? It's not just
This-
in the United States. Okay.
yes, that's right. It's a
Um,
global database.
So that kind of brings up an interesting point about what are the current challenges you have with dealing with such things as the National Spatial Infrastructure planning, or things of integrating things from critical infrastructure, U.S. and globally. Do you pull in things from the Highfeld database, for example, to help with disaster response situations?
Yeah, so not necessarily explicitly to help with disaster response, although we hope that the Overture data would be used for that. But we are looking for the best sources of high quality data. Highfeld is one of those that we have been looking at across different themes. So whether it's transportation or particularly places, places is one where I think the Highfield data contributes quite a bit. We have been looking at that, and ideally, our the goal for us is to bring in as many sources as it takes to be a data-driven product, meaning we're not just going to find one source for a particular type of feature and say, okay, that's the one we're going with. Ideally, we want to pull all of these things into our pipeline and pick the best of. And that might be, hey, we can get the best geometry from source A, but the best attributes from source B, or the best attributes from source B, C, and D, or we can use them in a confirmatory way. And so we are looking at the Highfield data and a variety of other infrastructure data globally. And I think that the whole idea is really to make sure that we're filling gaps, but that we're also gearing the releases that we have right now every month. Ideally, we'll increase that cadence, but that those releases are high quality. So, evaluating the data before it actually goes into our pipeline, understanding what the impacts of including that new data set into our pipeline would be, and understanding how we report different types of validation to our users to make sure that they understand that the processes that are happening within our pipelines, and that if it's something, for example, if we detect some kind of issue, that we're able to report that back out to both users and data source owners.
Taking a break from Overture specifically, the topics of interoperability and accessibility seem to be really, really important to you and actually Overture as a whole. So, can you explain what interoperability is in terms of the challenges that the geospatial community has, and from your perspective, and what you're doing to tackle that?
Yeah. Yeah, so I am a big proponent of not calling spatial special anymore, simply because I think it puts us in a category where people that work with data, whether data scientists or any other kind of practitioner, don't actually use it or think it's out of their realm or it's not useful. And so I think the more that we start integrating into kind of just how people work with data, the better we're going to get in terms of interoperability. And you can already see a lot of that playing out with a lot of the OGC standards that are coming out. So, for example, GeoParquet, building on the existing Parquet standard to make sure that there was spatial support for that. There's a lot of things that the community is starting to do, recognizing that those interoperability standards are important. But beyond interoperability standards in terms of formats, it's also about how do we make sure that we aren't kind of building these silos for ourselves. And a lot of times, part of the specialness of spatial data gets wrapped up in a particular use case or what the data was created for, and the formats and the structures that those data are in. And so you have a lot of legacy products, whether we're talking about specific formats or we're talking about data that was built for a specific purpose, that are either not discoverable or are not practically useful just simply because of a format they were built in. And so I think when we're talking about interoperability, it's not just about the format, but it is a big part of discovery, and it's a big part of making it easy, making interoperability simple and in a non-technical term. I mean, interoperability in a lot of ways, I think about, you have a lot of these home design pieces of software apps that you can download, and you can go on, you can say, I want to take a room that's 13 by 13 and I want to add this here and that there, and they have all the different pieces of furniture or different pieces of, if you're designing a kitchen, here's 3 fridges to pick from, and you can bring all that in. And the way I kind of think of interoperability is that it should be more like that. There should be an easy way to say, hey, I'm looking at this building in the world. What are all the things that are associated with this building in the world? And we don't have a good way to do that because we haven't found a consistent way to say we all talk about this building in the same way. And that's what we're trying to do with our global entity reference system. is not so much just tag things with IDs, but to say that when we are talking about building 1, 2, 3, we're all talking about the same building. Now, the way I represent it spatially, like I might have just a very rudimentary polygon. Somebody else might have a really nice 3D representation of it, or somebody else might have a point on the map. But the idea is to say when we're talking about a particular building, we have an easy way to interchange data because we're referencing it the same way. And that's really the point of Overture's data releases every month, is to be that reference map, which is why it's so important to be complete and as high quality as possible. So while I think a lot of people look at it as, hey, we're bringing all this data together, we're saving you a lot of time because you don't have to do that. I think the larger point is to get into the interoperability space where we are saying when we talk about building 1, 2, 3, this is what we mean. What is your building 1, 2, 3 in your data? It might look slightly different. You're definitely going to have different attributes. If you have a building that was derived from imagery and we are using from something from OpenStreetMap, might be different spatial representations. But we want to make sure that we're all starting to talk about the same building in a standardized way.
How are you pulling those points out and talking about it with your community members, and making sure that they know it's not just about the data, but they have to improve things on their side too?
Yeah, I think I think that's a longer conversation. There's steps that we're taking right now with a lot of things that we'll be rolling out in the next few months around. We call it GERS, Global Entity Reference System. We're not the best with acronyms, but it is what it is, and it's stuck now. So we're going to be rolling out a lot of things around GERS that explain this concept better and hopefully get people started thinking about how they can link their data to Overture. But if they don't want to necessarily link it to our data for any particular reason, like they don't need our data, they just want the ID, be able to let them match to Overture. We'll have a variety of guides, and some of our open source code repos will be published to allow them to actually get a GERS ID on their data. And whether they're linking it back to Overture data or linking it to another data set that has a GERS ID. We're going to be providing a lot of this information here in the next couple months to help people get jump started on that. And when I think about the challenges that we've had in geospatial and just the data silos, and how there's a lot of cases where we don't really have the luxury of trading urgency for fidelity or vice versa. Having that fast way to think about data as a simple table join rather than the kind of heavy lift that it's been for a while in putting things together. Yeah, that's a big part of what I'm excited about Overture for is that piece of it. And so being an open project, I think is really important to hear from the community and get the community involved. And admittedly, we have not done the best job of that so far. There's been a lot of work behind the scenes that we haven't really made transparent to the users, but I think that's about ready to change, and hopefully people will get a better understanding of the reference map, why we're building it the way we're building it, and hopefully start to use it in a way that makes interoperability more realistic, not just in the framing of standards.
Okay. Softball question for you. This is the really interesting one. I could throw a random one at you. You're talking about a lot of different types of data sets. When I actually just talk about a lot of issues with the accessing data sets, but I'm kind of curious, which data sets or data silos or sensor types do you found have been the biggest pain points for you to say, man, I wish these folks could just figure it out, that they need some standards. That which ones are your biggest headaches?
Well, addresses for sure.
Really?
Um,
Addresses? Well, I would have thought that would have been one of the most standardized out there.
well, I don't think it's that it's not standardized. I just think addresses are done so differently, different places in the world. that it becomes a challenge to kind of create a global standardized data set for addresses. Um, Plus, I think when you're talking about addresses, you also have anytime you deal with names or any kind of strings in data, you're dealing with inconsistencies right out of the gate. The other one would be places. So points of interest. There's a lot of challenges around that. There's really very few. You don't have a lot of national mapping agencies or even subnational organizations that are specifically collecting and maintaining those types of data sets. A lot of those data sets are really commercial at this point. And, you know, I think the challenge in doing something like a global places data set is multi-layered. One of the first ones is how dynamic that kind of data is. You have things opening, closing, things that are temporarily closing, right? So you can have things that are seasonal. You just have a lot of dynamic behavior in those kind of features that you don't see in things like buildings or roads. Those are much easier to detect change through sensors. And so when you're talking about places or points of interest, you're starting to think about what are creative ways that not only can we build something in the open, but what are ways that we can maintain that data. And so, for example, one of the things that we're doing at Overture is thinking about that maintenance. We've kind of started this process where we use signals from some of our members that isn't necessarily open data, but those signals can tell us kind of the heartbeat of a place. So thinking about the existence of a place, we can look at things like check-ins or, rideshare drop-offs or food deliveries or, any number of things that kind of give us a sense of, is this place still exist or is this place no longer showing any signs of life? And through those, that makes it a little bit easier to think about what a long-term maintenance strategy would be. But still, I think places for us is kind of the most interesting one because it doesn't really conform to a lot of the ways that you think about data collections from a national or subnational level.
So I got a hits that you deal with. Do you do anything directly or build any data sets related to activity data sets, or is this just static data?
Yeah, not necessarily activity data sets. This is all mostly, I guess, what you would call kind of built environment.
Okay.
Although in our base theme, we do have kind of physical environment like land cover and water, but for the most part, our themes are built around kind of the typical infrastructure that you would think of. Places are the one that stand out a little bit just because they're not necessarily referring to the physical infrastructure. They're referring to, I mean, to some degree, I guess, the activity, but really the what's happening at that location. So we could link a place to a building, link an address in a place, link those things together. But the place is really referring to typically a business or something that would be considered a point of interest, like a park.
And I actually think about things backwards in terms of places are the priority first, activities are secondary to the places, no matter what. And then those places, those activities, you mentioned one of those, which is seasonal times, or maybe those places are open. I'm like, that's to me, that's an activity of that place. And I'm like, well, that's interesting. And if there's a way to pull those types of feeds out and filter those types of facilities out that are just seasonally turned on, this kind of caught my eye a little bit. Um, so uh, so I want to kind of take it back because we're running short on time. Because I want to learn a little bit more about your membership in the National Geospatial Advisory Committee and what insights you can share about the current state of the geospatial data policy and initiatives in the U.S. as a whole. And then, kind of as a follow-on to that, is how's your work influence and align with your role at Overture?
Yeah. I was really excited to be appointed to the NGAC. I think it's been something that I've been following for several years since it was formed, and really, I mean, this is a group of people that is making recommendations on our geospatial policy at a national level, and I think that's a really important role. We have a lot of work to do, but I'm really encouraged not just by you know who else is on the committee. I mean, it's some really bright, talented, you know, it's a good group of people, very capable of making these kind of recommendations. But I'm also excited because there seems to be an energy around the National Spatial Data Infrastructure in a way that I haven't actually seen in maybe a while or maybe ever, um, both from the side of leadership in the Federal Geographic Data Committee, but also just in general. I think people are starting to see that it's not really the technology that has been the blocker. It's really more about kind of the what you would call the organizational or the people part of it. You know, how do we bring people together in the right way to talk about the right things? How do we think about partnerships? And so there is definitely a renewed push along the lines of the National Spatial Data Infrastructure to put something out there that's meaningful and that we can build on and do it in a way that isn't limiting and factors in not just a kind of um, I guess what you call it a government perspective, but bringing in a variety of stakeholders. And by bringing in that variety of stakeholders, I think that's where Overture really ties in. You know, one of the things that a nonprofit plays a role in, so somebody like Overture, and we do this every day, is bringing different stakeholders together under a shared mission. You know, identifying what's in it for stakeholder X, stakeholder Y, stakeholder Z. How can we bring those together where they're sharing the same mission, even though they're looking for either slightly different or very different outcomes? And so I think that's really good to see that that's going to be a big part of the NSDI strategic plan going forward. Is how do we make partnerships work for us? How do we bring the right people together and not just to talk about things, but to do things? I think, you know, we've viewed public-private partnerships in the past as something less than what it really should be. And I think there's a lot to gain by drawing on the strengths of, you know, public entities, private entities, and bringing those strengths together instead of, you know, the kind of typical contracting space that we've looked at before. And so I think from, you know, I think from the perspective of how I think you know, what the future holds, I'm pretty excited. I feel like there's a lot of momentum there. And I think looking at it through a different lens of, you know, we can do this in a way where we're drawing on the advantages of a variety of different stakeholders and a variety of sectors is the right path.
Is the topic of accessibility and interoperability one of the main messages you relay back to the National Geospatial Advisory Committee, or do you have other major themes that you're trying to hound the importance of to that committee?
Well, definitely partnerships. You know, I think partnerships are a really important one. And I think that's something where, you know, it could be really powerful if we dig into. But yes, interoperability, absolutely. Interoperability, accessibility, you know, making data, you know, findable, accessible, interoperable. All of these things are limitations that we've had in the past. And we all say we want to do these things, right? But how do we come together to actually make that a reality? And so, as I mentioned before, one of the things that I like most about Overture is tackling the interoperability issue. And I think if there's one thing that you know we can kind of help inform, whether it's, you know, through the NGAC or whether it's just through the data and geospatial communities, is better ways to think about interoperability and to start that flywheel going so that we have an ecosystem where it's a lot easier to do a lot of the repetitive, you know, we can call it data munging that we're all so used to at this point. There's a lot of ways that we can start to rethink the way that we work and communicate with each other to make those changes. So yes, definitely interoperability is at the top of the list.
Excellent. So the and that goes along to for some of our younger listeners who are just trying to understand geospatial, the industry as a whole or ecosystem as a whole. And it seems pretty obvious, perhaps, to folks like you and I who've been just so engulfed into the space. But what would you say the importance of open geospatial data is? What can you tell them?
Yeah, you know, again, I don't think all geospatial data should be open, but the value of having open data is, first of all, innovation. The more data that you can put out in the open, the more people can collaborate around it, the more people can start innovating on it. So you think about what, just the basic data that Overture has put out so far, and thinking about the kinds of things that that spawns. People have a large global data set to test, whether it's to understand how you can optimize some of your workflows with big data, or it could be to actually do analysis. And you wouldn't have that the opportunity for innovation where you don't have open data. Again, it also, I think, is a really good point of connection on collaborations. We're in a world now where it's not like several years ago where you could go out and do small projects by yourself and really get those up and running quickly. A lot of things that we do are very multidisciplinary. Sometimes takes working collaboratively across small or large teams to get them done. And open data makes that more accessible. So I think if you're just starting out in geospatial, I know there's going to be data that isn't and probably shouldn't be open for a variety of reasons, whether it's privacy or security or business reasons. But I would encourage people that are data owners that if they have any you know option to potentially open their data, to think about it from the perspective of starting with open first and then working backwards, instead of starting with my data is closed and then what are the reasons I might open it. Because I think if you start from, can I open my data? Okay, are there privacy issues? Are there security issues? And go through that kind of triage level. Then what you're doing is you're looking at it from a fresh perspective, and you're putting information out there that not just helps foster that innovation and collaboration, but I think also could be something critical in terms of natural disasters or emergency situations where you're filling a data gap that was previously there. And so I think there's so many reasons why if you can open your data, you should open your data. Um, but I would say the top of my list, just from my perspective right now, is I've seen open data be the catalyst for so much innovation, that I think that's really a big piece of it.
That's a really good answer. So we are wrapping up. My last question, very last question for you is, I usually ask where can people find more about Overture. I don't like look. It's obvious the Overture website's pretty easy, but what I'd like to ask you instead is how would you ask people who want to get involved with Overture? What would you recommend to them for that?
Yeah, well, I think first off, if you have specific data that you feel you would like to contribute, absolutely reach out. We have GitHub discussion forums, so we're in the process of moving a lot of our repos into public now, but we do have discussion forums out there. Certainly reach out to us there. But think the big thing is using the data, and here in the next couple months starting to try to use some of the guides and the way that we're talking about GERS to start linking data, and start establishing this ecosystem. I mean, I think, as I mentioned before, we haven't been as I guess transparent or open as we could be in the future. And I think a lot of that's just because there was a lot of work going on behind the scenes, that just trying to get to the point where we thought it was a useful, whether it's converting our code repos to public, or whether it's putting out guides or tools for users. But now we're going to be in the space, certainly this summer, where there's going to be a lot more for users to engage in. And what we'd like to be able to see is that we have a real Overture community. So, being able to give people starting points to actually on board to Overture, whether it's just using the data, whether it's getting involved with GERS and being able to start linking data sets and build that broader ecosystem. Or there's going to be a lot of things coming down the road where we're actually within those repos going to give um, both users and any other contributors ways to contribute back to the project. So making sure it's a lot more open and accessible for people to actively engage.
Oh, thank you very much for giving me these insights. Amy, we're wrapping up, and I want to thank our listeners for tuning in. I'm Adam Simmons of Project Geospatial here with Amy Rose of Overture Maps. And once again, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.